Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of Reasonable Discourse. I'm Terry Young, this is my colleague Shawn McAvoy, and today we're going to talk about the upcoming statewide elections here in Virginia, some interesting storylines, some interesting things to talk about in regards to that. And Shawn, Virginia's gubernatorial election typically attracts a lot of attention nationally, in part because Virginia and New Jersey are the only states that hold their elections in odd years, and it always comes on the heels of the presidential election. So often we'll hear political pundits talk about what does the Virginia gubernatorial election say about the president's approval rating and things along those lines. I know we heard a lot about that in 2009 when Republican Bob McDonnell won the Virginia election and Chris Christie won in New Jersey. Well, I have the stat for you, Shawn. I'm going to suggest that it means absolutely nothing.
You have just unemployed a whole group of pundits.
I know, and so if you folks hear anyone talk about the connection between the president's approval rating and the Virginia election, just completely ignore them. We are perhaps headed towards something of a historical election if you believe the polls, because for the last 40 years, Shawn, going back to 1973, Virginians have not elected a governor who is of the same political party as the sitting president. That was back at the end of the Bird Machine era when there was no suspense. Virginia always elected Democrats. But that, to me, that's pretty amazing that that's been the case since 1973, before that's happened. It was Mills Godwin running as a Republican back then in 1973 after he'd served his first term as a Democrat at the end of the Bird Machine. And Shawn, there used to be very little suspense about Virginia politics. What can you tell us about the Bird Machine and the solid South as it existed here in Virginia?
Well, in particular, the Bird Machine is, or the Bird Organization refers to essentially the reign of Harry Flood Bird, who was once governor of Virginia and then later senator from Virginia. From about 1930 to 1970, Bird dominated Virginia politics. As soon as he became governor, he immediately pushed through a constitutional amendment restricting our statewide elected offices to just the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the attorney general.
And that's good. We only have 3 races to talk about today.
3 races, and he did that. Then he created what were called courthouse cliques, where he made sort of backroom political deals with various officials around the state. And when it came to election time, as you said, there were no surprises. It was Democrats of whom Bird approved, and it did not change until basically around his death.
So really, Virginia was a one-party state, a Democratic state. It wasn't until 1969 when Linwood Holton becomes the first Republican governor in 100 years since Reconstruction. But since that time, you know, we hear a lot about red states, blue states, that sort of thing. Virginia sort of got the reputation as a conservative state, in part because we had that run of 10 straight presidential elections where Virginia voted for a Republican presidential candidate. But as I mentioned, the state elections have always been different. So if someone's trying to characterize Virginia today, where it sits on the political spectrum, what would your take on that be?
Bifurcated. From what I have seen, Virginia in the rural areas is pretty conservative these days, although interestingly that hasn't always been the case. You go back to elections such as the presidential race for Jimmy Carter. Interestingly, some of the western Virginia counties went for Carter. But today, rural areas tend to be strongly conservative. Urban areas tend to be very strongly liberal. And it results in Virginia being, well, the swing state we have today.
And I think those pundits that we're making fun of have referred to it as a purple state, you know, somewhere in between a conservative state and a more liberal state. Well, how does, you know, let's talk a little bit about the elections this time and maybe how Virginia's political characteristics sort of play out in this election. First, of course, we'll talk about the gubernatorial election. That doesn't seem to have generated a lot of enthusiasm for either candidate, but the polls show that Virginia, the Democratic candidate, Terry McAuliffe, seems to have a significant advantage at this point over Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli. What is your take on our candidates for governor?
Well, I have to agree. They both seem weak. I admit I'm unimpressed by either of them. But it's interesting to watch. You had mentioned that we're getting into an election where we might see a governor of the same party as the president elected. And in particular, this seems to be due really to Cuccinelli. He, according to the latest analyses, only has 80% of the state's Republicans backing him, which sounds like a lot until you consider that in Virginia politics, since the second Godwin administration, no governor really has gotten into office without almost 100% of his party behind him, plus usually people from the other side backing them. With Cuccinelli being 80%, that's 1 in 5 Republicans who don't like him or won't support him, which is very interesting.
What do you think about Cuccinelli that has created this lack of support within the Republican Party, and I guess if we talked about moderates and independents, maybe this concern about him as a governor?
I'm still honestly not 100% sure about that. And looking at that, I know some recent pundits have claimed that the government shutdown is greatly responsible. That because he showed such tepid support for federal employees in Virginia. But he already had lost support before that time.
Sure.
He seemed to have never completely gained traction. And I have not yet seen what to me is a completely convincing explanation. What about you? Do you have an opinion?
Well, I do have an opinion. I think in part, generally we think about Virginia being somewhat socially conservative, but I think only to, again, that depends on what area of the state you're in. And I think that social conservatism only goes to a certain point. I think what has hurt Ken Cuccinelli is that certainly among more independent voters, they think about things that, early on in his tenure as Attorney General, he went after a scientist at the University of Virginia. Actually, he was at Penn State, formerly at the University of Virginia, for research he had done about global warming, climate change, asserting that he had committed fraud on the Virginia taxpayers and put a lot of taxpayer money in that effort to bring him to justice, so to speak, which fell flat on its face. And I think perhaps Cuccinelli's opinion about climate change may not be in line with that of most Virginians, and certainly not the overwhelming majority of scientists. Early on, he made a point that Virginia's anti-discrimination policies did not apply to individuals because of sexual orientation, something that the governor actually kind of pulled back on kind of overrode Cuccinelli's opinion on that. And then just recently he has made some comments seemingly trying to stir up the conservative base, which I think the conservative base will be very supportive of Ken Cuccinelli, but he made comments recently about the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, comparing it to the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. And so I think a lot of Virginians, even if they don't like Obamacare, aren't willing to equate it to slavery. And so I think that may be an issue for him. And it's interesting because the recent polls have Terry McAuliffe with a pretty safe margin. One poll actually had him up by 17 points. That seems to be an outlier, but generally 7 to 8 percentage points, even though Terry McAuliffe's approval rating is -7. And if we go back and look at a couple of previous gubernatorial elections, in 2001, Mark Warner was a very popular politician, had a +31 approval rating, yet only won over Mark Early by about 6% of the vote. Tim Kaine had a +24 approval rating, and he only won by about 5% over Jerry Kilgore. But now someone who has a negative approval rating may win by a significant margin. And so I think you're right when you say the issue really is the lack of popularity for Cuccinelli as opposed to any sort of positive thoughts that folks have about Terry McAuliffe.
And there's one other thing about Virginia that has always struck me that I think makes Virginia politics different that may play into this. For instance, in the current race, we have a third gubernatorial candidate most people don't know about, a libertarian.
Sardis.
Now, granted, right now he has about 10% in the polls last I checked, but that's still 1 in 10 Virginians backing the Libertarian. And I sometimes think it's inaccurate to call Virginia necessarily a conservative state so much as a libertarian state, since the state has such a strong streak in it of that attitude of leave me alone, let me live my life. Do you think that there's a possibility that maybe Cuccinelli or some of the people in the Republican Party are misreading Virginians, that they're taking it as too much, they're conservative, they're not recognizing that libertarian streak?
Yeah, I'm not sure, because you would think that libertarians would want any alternative other than Terry McAuliffe as governor, and certainly some of the issues that they would favor, I think Cuccinelli probably has similar views, certainly as far as government overreach goes. I don't know. That's a good question. It's interesting to me that there have been a couple of major newspapers in Virginia that have refused to support either of the two primary candidates in Cuccinelli and McAuliffe, yet they did not pull the trigger for the Libertarian candidate. Instead, the Richmond Times-Dispatch refused to endorse anyone, and the Charlottesville Daily Progress actually endorsed Lieutenant Governor Bill Bolling as a write-in candidate. So, it's interesting. Maybe Virginia is not as conservative as people believe it is. I mean, we talk about those pockets of conservatism, and because of that, certainly when you talk about the House of Delegates and the state Senate, that allows Republicans to maintain their control in state government. But then when you have a statewide election and you get that significant population, obviously, in Northern Virginia, which is going to be much more liberal than the rest of Virginia, I think that shows itself, and we've seen that in the last two presidential elections, and we may be seeing it in this election. But sometimes, it comes down to just the quality of the candidates, and it may be that most Virginians look at Terry McAuliffe as the lesser of two evils between he and Ken Cuccinelli.
Which would make sense with his negative ratings, and he's still ahead in the race.
Sure. And I guess we have to start looking at what will be the impact on the other state races and perhaps the future of the Republican Party and the Democratic parties in Virginia as we go forward. Why don't we talk a little bit about the Attorney General's race? And no disrespect to our lieutenant gubernatorial candidates, but quite frankly, Shawn, if Virginia elected a border collie as lieutenant governor, it would have no impact on state government. That is one of those positions that is just sort of there, isn't it? I mean, what does the lieutenant governor really do for us?
Lieutenant governor, to be honest, they're waiting to see if they become governor one day.
Right. If there's a tie in the Senate.
And a tie in the Senate.
They get involved, they vote, or if something happens to the governor. Otherwise, they're kind of there. But we will talk about those folks. But interesting Attorney General election, and one that is probably the closest of all statewide elections right now, and that's between Republican Mark Obenshain and Democrat Mark Herring. Mark Obenshain is someone whose family has a big name in Virginia politics. We talked about that domination of the Byrd machine and the Democrats. That was broken in part by the generation which Mark Obenshain's father, Richard Obenshain, played an important role in the Republican Party, maybe the first real beacon of true conservatism in Virginia back in the 1970s. I mentioned Linwood Holton had won election as governor in 1969. Holton considered a more moderate Republican. But then it was Richard Obenshain who in 1978 became the Republican nominee for U.S. Senate over John Warner, over Linwood Holton, seemed to be well on his way to becoming the U.S. Senator. Was tragically killed in a plane crash returning from a campaign appearance a few months before the election. So John Warner became the Republican candidate for Senate, and we know what happened with John Warner. For 30 years, 5 terms he served as U.S. Senator. So Mark Obenshain's family, his sister was also the head of the Republican Party in Virginia, has a long history in Virginia. He, like Cuccinelli, is a conservative. But I noticed in his campaign he really seems to be talking about issues that are not necessarily partisan. Ending human trafficking in Virginia, going after sexual predators, the kind of things that are pretty safe
things that will
issues.
Definitely win elections.
Exactly. So polls show that's very close in his race against Mark Herring. And I think for Republicans, this may be the most important race. We'll talk about the lieutenant governor's race. Things do not look good for Republicans there. We discussed the fact that Cuccinelli is way behind McAuliffe in the polls. So if we look forward to the 2017 election, yeah, which is kind of crazy, this may be their best chance is to get Mark Obenshain in office. So it'll be interesting to see how that race turns out. In the lieutenant governor's race, it seems to be a resolved issue that Ralph Northam will win as the Democrat. The Republican candidate, E.W. Jackson, has generated some controversy. What are your thoughts about that race? Have you paid much attention to what's going on with lieutenant governor? I was casting aspersions about that position. But
admittedly, no. I've been having more fun watching the gubernatorial race.
Right. Well, E.W. Jackson is a pastor and has been accused of saying some things that some folks may say are ultra-conservative as it relates to social conservatism. And his response has been that things that he says in the pulpit as a pastor does not indicate how he would govern as lieutenant governor or how he would treat Virginians. But perhaps the damage has been done because it appears that Ralph Northam, who was a physician in the Army for quite a while and is a current state senator from the Eastern Shore area, it looks like he is in control of that race. So we now have folks talking about, that who, if Northam wins, will he then be the candidate against Mark Obenshain if Obenshain wins in 2017? So again, we're already focusing on what's going ahead there. But I do think it's going to be an interesting election. I think for Mark Obenshain, he has to hope that these polls that show Ken Cuccinelli behind by 10%, 17%, that those are more outliers, that Cuccinelli can close the gap a little bit, because it's going to be tough for a Republican to win on a ticket if the governor's getting beat real badly at the top of the ticket.
True, and if the Republicans have too much trouble, you need to really wonder about that 17 election, since we will be coming up to another census in 2020, which could see redistricting, which could then hurt the Republican Party on a more permanent basis.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. There's not been a lot of discussion about this being an election in which Democrats are going to gain a lot of seats in the state Senate or the House of Delegates, but if that should happen, and we see congressional redistricting, we see redistricting within the state Senate and the House of Delegates, that's when we might really see Virginia go from being a red state to a blue state, because we know once political parties are in power, they're going to do whatever they can to stay in power.
Exactly.
So that's a good point. So it'll be interesting to see how those elections in the House of Delegates and state Senate go, because even if the Democrats win, well, I would say this, if the Democrats win the gubernatorial election, Republicans will have to be a little stung by that, because certainly in 2009, when Bob McDonnell won quite handily, the future seemed to be much brighter for Republicans in Virginia than it did for Democrats. But now, looking backwards, we go back to 2008. Democrats won the presidential election in Virginia. Mark Warner, who is a very popular senator. In fact, we mentioned John Warner, who, as a Republican, sometimes Virginia Democrats didn't even run anyone against him, or just a candidate who they knew had no chance. Republicans may be looking at the same thing with Mark Warner. He defeated another former governor by 30 points in the 2008 election. That's a blowout, and I don't see anyone who can challenge him from the Republican side in 2014. Then, of course, in 2012, once again the Democrats won in Virginia. Barack Obama won by about 140,000 votes. And then George Allen, who had been a very popular governor as a Republican, but lost his Senate seat to Jim Webb, ran again, this time against another former governor, Tim Kaine, and the Democrat Tim Kaine won. So I think Republicans will have to be concerned if they lose this gubernatorial election, just because they've had a string of statewide elections where they've not done well.
And it will also be interesting if McAuliffe were to win, since McAuliffe And I know many people would tend to assume that McAuliffe, being a Democrat, would automatically march in lockstep with the president. But McAuliffe, being an old Clinton person, and Clinton and Obama do not get along at all, it would be very interesting if McAuliffe wanted to see how Virginia will interact with the federal government at that point. That's not a guarantee that we will be taking the steps that the president wants Virginia to take.
Sure. And if McAuliffe does win, I mean, we expect that both the state Senate and the House of Delegates will still be under Republican control. You know, how will a Democratic governor govern under those circumstances? And it may be that he takes a page from his good friend Bill Clinton.
Move to the center.
Move to the center, as Clinton did after 1994 when the Republicans won big time in Congress, and you know, that helped Clinton's popularity and enabled him to win re-election in 1996.
Which could be a big worry, which might be actually possibly the worst outcome for Republicans. If McAuliffe were to win and then he were to move to the center and prove to be at least a competent governor, it would make Democrats in Virginia look not so bad. So maybe going under, you know, changing of the guard to moving to a blue state wouldn't be so bad to many Virginians. That would be the nightmare scenario.
Yeah, and on the other hand, even if the opposite of that would be McAuliffe wins, and so Republicans are a bit discouraged, but he doesn't move to the center and throws up an agenda that it's easy for Virginian Republicans to say, look, that's not what Virginia is about, we reject that, so that McAuliffe is sort of the bad guy for trying to push through a liberal agenda. So that's why it's kind of, maybe it's silly for us to talk about 2017, but McAuliffe could hand it to the Republicans as a gift if things go badly. I mean, and things can change so dramatically. 2 years ago, Bob McDonnell still had very high approval ratings, but with some of the scandals that have plagued his administration, things changed quickly, and they changed very dramatically.
In the end, it just shows you that Virginia really is one of the more important states in the Union when it comes to our local politics.
Sure.
What happens here really does have an impact nationwide.
Let me ask you one more thing, I guess, before we finish up today. If we look at where Republicans are now in Virginia, having lost those last two presidential elections, and if you go back the last couple of decades, you know, I think back to the 1994 U.S. Senate election when it was a very bad situation for Democrats nationally. Republicans gained control of Congress, but here in Virginia, they ran a very socially conservative, controversial candidate in Oliver North against Chuck Robb, who was plagued by all sorts of scandals, seemed to be dead in the water, but perhaps was fortunate enough to run against the only man that he could possibly beat. And that came out of the Republican convention where they had another candidate, Jim Miller, who had been budget director for Reagan, seemed to be much more moderate, who may have been a sure thing if they had picked him. And then we come forward here to 2013. Bill Bolling, as lieutenant governor, does not have the negative perception that Ken Cuccinelli has. Do you think Republicans have to look at perhaps maybe moving more towards the center to win these statewide elections?
In a perfect world, perhaps, but the way that the primary system is used today, and this really applies to both state races and national races, you tend to have in primary races only the base of either side turning out. So for the Democrats, you'll tend to have what you'd consider the far left liberals, who are the only ones making the choices on the right, the far right or the Tea Party people making the choices. Until that is analyzed further and addressed, I really don't see candidates coming out of either party that are more moderate.
Okay. Be interested to see what happens. And in fact, you know, it was convention that Ken Cuccinelli used, and as did Oliver North, to sort of make sure that they controlled the party apparatus to make sure they were nominated. So we'll see what happens. We have, I think, some interesting elections in Virginia. We'll see if they tighten up a little bit, and maybe when it's all said and done, we can come back and talk about what it really means for politics in Virginia's future. I'm Terry Young. This is Shawn McAvoy, and we appreciate you guys joining us.
Have a good evening.